Welcome to Session 6 in the UC Migration Webinar Series. I'm Rich Steves, Web Editor at TMC.
And I'm Alan Percy, Senior Director of Marketing at AudioCodes.
So what's our topic for this session?
So now we're going to talk about the branch office. And obviously many businesses have branch offices in retail, financial services, insurance, for example, have small branch offices scattered often around the country, around the globe. And they want to be able to be integrated closely into a Microsoft Lync environment and have survivability. So this is a big topic about moving Microsoft Lync and UC to survivable branch offices. So it takes some specialized technology and techniques. We're going to cover that in this session.
Okay. And who are the presenters that will cover that topic?
So, the sessions for the speakers for this particular session are Tarek Roddy again. He's joining us again. He's a senior program manager, and of course he's been deeply involved in Lync and the interoperability program. We're also going to be joined by Alex Beletsky. Alex comes from Sentri, one of our partners, and Alex is a recognized communication expert and a regular industry speaker in the area of business process management, service operations, customer relationship management, and contact center architecture. Their reseller business is based in New York City, and he joins us with some real-world experience on branch office deployments that Sentri's deployed.
Perfect. Well, let's hear what they have to say.
All right.
So the question always comes up is, was survivability really a big deal? Well, it turns out back in April of 2009, there was just one example of the kinds of things that can happen that are totally outside a business's control. And this news article from the Mercury News points out that somebody back in 2009 crawled down into a manhole in the region between Morgan Hill and San Jose. And for those of you who know the area, that's the core of Silicon Valley. So this is an area that's pretty heavily dependent on their communications infrastructure. They crawled down in a manhole, and using a hacksaw, they managed to cut a major fiber line. And that fiber line knocked out not only telephone service, but it knocked out all the cell phone service and knocked out all the internet and certainly all the other infrastructure that depends on that. And sort of an interesting twist on it too is, over the radio they were announcing that if you had an emergency, since the phones didn't work, run outside and flag a passing patrol car or drive to the nearest fire station. So obviously not an ideal situation, and certainly many businesses had to close because of this situation. Well, fortunately, they were able to repair it quickly, but it is just one example of the kinds of things that happen, and it happens all too often, usually due to construction accidents where a fiber optic cable is dug up, as opposed to we'll call it regional domestic terrorism, like this particular case. So when we deal with this, we often struggle with, I call it the spectrum of architectures for communication systems. We love the concept of fully centralized solutions. We're going to talk about what that means in a moment, or the concept of fully distributed. And there's sort of the scale back and forth of, do we choose a fully centralized solution or fully distributed solution? And across the scale, there's a couple of options. And so let's just take a look at the fully distributed architecture. And this is pretty common, by the way. This is usually for most businesses that have existing TDM PBXs. This is the reality of how they're deployed. They would most likely, each store or branch would have their own complete standalone system. They would be connected to the public network. They might be connected to the WAN, but they really wouldn't be, leveraging any kind of common shared resources in the cloud, for example, or in a data center. And as a matter of fact, in a Lync environment, we've even seen some customers implement Lync in this situation where they put separate individual Lync pools at each of the branches. As a matter of fact, one of the case studies that we talked about earlier in the series, the Georgia Military College chose this architecture to maximize their survivability, but certainly there's additional costs in this particular configuration. Another configuration that's quite common that we see is a fully centralized architecture. And this is where you move the entire Lync pool to the data center or to the cloud, putting the absolute minimum equipment necessary out of the remoter branches. We're putting just basic phones, maybe a router and a switch out at the branch. The client, certainly PCs would be connected to that, but there's no Lync footprint out at the branches. And the pro to this is you've now centralized all your services to a common shared data pool, and also to a common shared gateway and PSTN connectivity, which certainly improves cost. But you leave yourself at a very vulnerable spot where if there's any kind of WAN outage, whether it be systemic across the board or just a regional outage, that those branches, of course, are left with no connectivity at all and no functionality. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, have to either close or send the employees home. So the question comes up is, well, what's realistic? That fully centralized architecture is really not practical. The fully distributed is not practical for most businesses. So what we do find is that most businesses choose something in between. And when we get to the case study, you'll hear about sort of blended environments where different branches have different choices or make different choices for their configuration. So some food for thought. What we do see is a hybrid architecture, and this is what we're going to talk about today. And this is where we're going to put Lync at the core. This is in either hosted or data center environment, maybe regionally. And we're going to put some intelligence out at each branch with some connectivity to the outside world at the branches. And this limited connectivity or capability is going to be hosted using what we're going to call a Survivable branch appliance. And you're going to learn about those today. And matter of fact, Tarek, we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to turn the call over to Tarek Roddy, and Tarek's going to do a desktop share and show you some really neat animations about branch office deployment. So cool, take it from here, Tarek.
Thank you, Alan. Everything shows fine?
Yeah, it looks great.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to present this topic to you today and share with you how SBAs can bring significant cost savings to you as an enterprise customer. After this session, if you have any follow-up questions or need additional details, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information is displayed here. Note that the slides will also be made available after the session. Before we begin, I need to present this disclaimer. Please note that this presentation is provided as is and does not provide you with any legal rights to any Microsoft intellectual property. Also note that this session is being recorded and that any feedback you provide today may be used by Microsoft. There are a lot more details here that you can read later. Here's the agenda for today's session. We'll start out by quickly setting the stage and explaining what SBAs are. This will also help address any possible terminology disconnects. We will then discuss some of the best practices for deploying and using SBAs with Microsoft Lync. This will be the meat of the presentation, and we'll walk through many different failure scenarios and see how SBAs help maintain a business's operations during those failures. I'll show some detailed code flows to help with this. Please note that by no means are the scenarios I present today an exhaustive list that SBAs provide. Finally, I'll touch on the Lync qualification process that partners undergo to ensure that SBAs they build meet a particular high-level quality bar and then end up on our Microsoft TechNet website as a qualified SBA to run with Lync. This part of the session is intended to help you in your SBA purchasing decision process. Now let's get started. What is an SBA? In a nutshell, as Alan mentioned, a Survivable branch appliance is a purpose-built device that is optimized to provide resilient multimodal communication that maximizes productivity of branch office users. They're easy to deploy, and that is very important since IT is typically not located at a branch. IT can centrally manage these SBAs from the data center or from the headquarters. Let's see where an SBA gets installed at a high level. Here you have a branch. Here you have a data center or the main headquarters. The branch has a PSTN connection to the data center and a WAN connection. The SBA sits at the branch, as you saw from Alan's slides, and leverages WAN and PSTN connections. When WAN outages occur, employees still expect to make and receive phone calls. That's where SBAs come in. They aim to maximize productivity of employees at the branch by increasing voice resiliency and availability in branch office scenarios, thereby improving user satisfaction, of course. They're not typically used for branches with more than 1,000 users. We'll discuss target branch sizes shortly. Here's a summary of the points I just mentioned. It is important to note that SBAs are built by Microsoft UC partners and run Microsoft software. SBAs are blade servers that run Windows Server 2008 R2. And they also run Microsoft Lync Server 2010. Especially the registrar service and the mediation server role. And I'll be talking more about the registrar servers because that's key. SBAs have a public switch telephony network gateway as well. All this is in a single appliance chassis. In fact, some gateways can be converted to SBAs by simply applying a SBA firmware. That's how much of a gateway functionality they provide. Of course, customers have the option of installing the Lync Server 2010 registrar service and mediation server role on their Windows Server 2008 R2 machine and set up the necessary configurations to provide the functionality that this dedicated appliance would have provided them. However, as you can imagine, it is much easier to buy the appliance and make use of its simplified manageability and deployment capabilities, and also make use of the support that it comes with. It's backed up by the Microsoft UC partner that built and provided that SBA, such as in this case, AudioCodes. I need to focus a bit on the registrar component, as I mentioned. This is a component that is in the SBA. As we'll talk about this in different outage scenarios later in the section. The registrar handles user registration and executes all voice routing functionalities, including such things as simultaneous ringing and call forwarding. The registrar is separate from the user service component, which handles user presence and conferencing needs. These two components used to be tied together in OCS 2007 if you've been using OCS 2007, but in Lync 2010 scenarios, they're separate. The registrar has its own SQL Express database where it stores basic information allowing resiliency of database outages as well. This means that the backend database can be upgraded or patched while users are still allowed and able to register and continue to operate. This was not the case in OCS 2007. However, in Lync 2010, we did some re-architecting such that the registrar can be installed as a standalone component, such as it is here with the SBA. And I called it out here, registrar. In summary, the SBA provides SIP registration functionality during normal and failover modes. It also acts as a SIP proxy and routing engine for PSTN connectivity, voicemail routing, and PSTN rerouting. And finally, it is centrally managed and provisioned without having to log on to each SBA at each site. We'll talk more about management and deployment later. So who could use an SBA? In essence, many customers that use Lync 2010 in their UC deployment can benefit from an SBA. And there is a growing list of customers leveraging Lync. Here's a NASCAR diagram that shows a sampling of customers who use Lync for enterprise voice. If you want to see how each one of these deployed Lync and want to read up more about them, then I would recommend you take a look at the case study for which we have a bunch of case studies on lync.com, one case study per customer. Customers like these would probably care about voice resiliency, right? Probably they do, of course. Dial tone should always be on, even when PBXs are being maintained or replaced. They can maintain voice resiliency for their branches using an SBA. But the size of the branch matters. Which version they use also matters. With version 1 of the SBA specification, SBAs were mostly applicable to branches that had more than 25 employees, but less than 1,000. But SBAs became more popular in branches of that size. The demand for SBAs in small branches with fewer than 25 employees became higher. So we surveyed 155 enterprise customers and found that 19% of those had branches with fewer than 20 people per branch, as you can see here. We also surveyed 71 upper mid-market companies and found that 27% of them had fewer than 20 employees per branch. And 91 core mid-market customers, 38% of them had these small branches. So it was a significant market share that version 1 of the SBA specification was not targeting. So we came up with version 2 of the specification. In summary, this updated version of the specification has 4 key features that I think are worthy to be highlighted and mentioned here. First, because it uses non-ECC memory, which is error-correcting code memory, deployments are less expensive, and we can now target these to small branches. Also, they provide you with virtualization. SBAs can run in a guest OS or as a host OS. It also allows multiple virtualized applications to run simultaneously. UCMA support is also a key feature of SBA version 2. Using UCMA, some of the features such as IVR, call center apps, bandwidth optimization, and others can be made available on these SBAs. Finally, SBAs with version 2 allow failover and resiliency using 3G and 4G connections, and we'll have a diagram to show that case later. Now that you're aware of the 2 versions of the specification, it becomes easier to explain the different resiliency options you have at your disposal when using SBAs. I'll show you these options now. Here we have the data center again, with both WAN and PSTN connections. For small branches with fewer than 25 users, we recommend SBAs that recommend version 2 of the SBA specification. For medium-sized branches that are larger than 25 users but less than 1,000, either version 1 or version 2 of the SBA would work fine. For larger branches, we recommend a Survivable branch server, or even a standalone edition Lync server with its own separate media gateway. So let's assume you have a branch that meets the size criteria and that you have decided to deploy an SBA. How do you go about deploying the SBA? Let's take a look. You might remember from earlier in this webinar that one of the goals of SBAs is to have a very simple and easy to deploy story that is very easy to repeat and apply at different branches across our organization. Microsoft worked with Gateway and SBA Partners to simplify this as much as possible. Here I'll present you with 2 deployment paths. One done by the Lync admin in the data center on top here, and one done by the Lync partner technician at the branch office through the web-based UI, and that will be at the bottom. The Lync admin starts off by accessing the Active Directory and editing it to create an entry for the SBA. Then the admin adds the SBA to the Lync topology using Topology Builder. The Topology Builder is a tool that comes with Lync and helps you identify the topology that you need to build for your Lync deployment. Then the admin can use PowerShell or the Lync control panel to move users to the SBA. After that, the admin is done. Pretty easy. As for the configuration that takes place at the branch, first the Microsoft Lync partner ships the SBA and software to the branch. Then the technician can use the web-based UI of the SBA to configure it, and then joins the SBA to the domain as appropriate. And then the technician enables configuration replication so that the SBA can contact the data center to collect the configuration data required, and then starts that service. So now that the SBA is deployed, how about changes to the configuration? How do these happen? Let's take a look. Here the Lync admin in the data center changes some normalization routes or routing rules, for example. Or even let's assume he changes user policies. The Lync central management server takes that information and replicates it to the SBA in the different branches as such. The SBAs at the branch offices receive these changes and process them separately. Of course, you can force replication or choose when to apply your settings manually, but the default here is the replication happens automatically. Now that an SBA has been configured from the data center, let's see what happens when a branch user tries to register. In this slide, I'll show you some details of signal call flows between the user and the SBA and the data center. On the left, you have the branch office where Bob resides, and on the right, you have the data center with the Lync server deployed. First, Bob's Lync-capable device, or Lync client, performs a DNS serve query. the Active Directory domain controller responds with the fully qualified domain name to the Lync server director. In other words, a reference to that director. Now Bob's device performs a SIP registration to that director using TLS. The director responds with a 401 redirect to the certification provider. Bob's device accesses that certification service and is authenticated and receives a certificate. The important thing is that this certificate is also replicated to the SBA in the branch office. This is very important because if the WAN connection goes down, branch users can still authenticate using the certificate replicated on the SBA in the branch. Bob's device then performs a SIP registration to the director and gets a 301 redirect that indicates to Bob's device that it should use the SBA as its primary pool, while it should use the Enterprise Edition server in the data center as its backup pool. This definition of primary and backup pool is very key, and you'll see it in the failover scenarios as I present them later. Now Bob's device performs a SIP registration in TLS mode with the SBA in the branch and receives a 200 OK, caching the SBA's fully qualified domain name and IP address for future registrations. Now that we've deployed the SBA and we've seen how to manage a replication of changes and we've seen how Bob's device can register, let's take a look now at some different outage scenarios. But before we do so, I need to show you what the normal mode operation is, so you can get a sense of what happens differently during outages. Remember the SBA's registrar component that we talked about in the initial slides? Well, branch users will always register with the SBA registrar unless the SBA is unreachable. So it's always going to use a primary registrar, which is in the SBA, unless it's unreachable. So when the branch users attempt to register, they will contact the SBA, as you can see here. They're registering through the SBA. This also applies to users who are logged on remotely, as shown here. So now this user is logged on remotely, but he's SBA homed. The signaling goes through the data center, through the WAN, and to the SBA. So he registers again with the SBA. Let's consider a scenario when the WAN goes down, as shown here. Branch users will still try to register with the SBA if they can, and they can. As you can see here, they don't need to go through the WAN, so they successfully register. However, remote branch users will be routed to their backup registrar, which is typically configured to be the data center registrar. In other words, the SBA registrar acts as primary registrar pool for these branch users, while the backup registrar pool would be the data center. In this case, both these users get all their functionality. The primary reasons for always setting the SBA's registrar as the primary registrar pool is that it helps minimize traffic to the data center and ensures that the SBA is on the primary path. So you know when it's unreachable and fully functional, unless you are routed to the backup registrar pool in the data center. Note that in Lync topologies, the relationship between primary and backup pool is not user-based. It is pool-based. You actually specify a backup pool for the primary pool. You don't specify the backup pool for each user in the organization. Also, the backup pool will not accept user registrations unless the backup pool no longer gets the heartbeat from the primary pool. The failover interval to the backup pool is configurable. The default is 2 minutes, but you can change that. So what happens in the case when the SBA is down? After all, it will eventually have to be maintained, right? Sooner or later. So in this case, we show you the SBA going down. Local and remote branch users need to register with the backup registrar pool because the SBA is down. And this backup registrar pool, as we mentioned, is in the data center. So the SBA branch users, where's my mouse? Here you go. Register with the or access the backup pool, and so does the remote user. They don't go through the SBA at all. Let's take a bit deeper look at the scenario in the middle, where the WAN connection goes down. Specifically, let me show you what the user experience looks like for an SBA homed user when the WAN is down. To illustrate, let's assume I'm the SBA homed user. So in a sunny day scenario, here's how my Lync client would look like when the WAN is up. When the WAN goes down, I lose connectivity to the data center, and I get this indication in the UI, and it says that I have limited functionality due to a WAN outage. Here's a list of voice features that are still available when the WAN is down. Notice that dial tone is still available, and I can make and receive calls through the PSTN, not over WAN. And I can call colleagues at other branches. I can make inter-site calls. And I can call colleagues in my branch as well, i.e. intra-site calls. All this happens over PSTN and not over VoIP. Here's a summary of all the features that are not available when the WAN is down. As you would expect, inter-site data communications such as IM, app sharing, etc. will not work. Also notice that my contact list goes away. Let's assume my WAN connection comes back up, and I'm back to the sunny day scenario where I have all the Lync functionality available to me. Now let's assume that while everything is up and running, I call a colleague of mine and that colleague is in the same branch. Let's see how the call flows happen for that, so we can understand what happens differently during failure scenarios. As you can see from this figure, the media between my Lync client and my colleague's Lync client happens peer-to-peer, with the red line here, while the signaling goes through the SBA, since the SBA is the entity that routes the call. Now let's assume that after I'm done calling my colleague in the same branch, I need to call my wife at home. As you can see on the right side, the media and signaling now goes through the SBA and goes through the PSTN. So this shows you the sunny day scenario, local calls, and PSTN calls. Now let's assume I decide to call another colleague of mine, but that colleague is not in the branch as me. That colleague, let's assume, is working at the corporate headquarters. In this case, they have this phone at the corporate headquarters. Signaling still happens through the SBA to the data center to the phone, but audio and video happen peer-to-peer through the WAN connection. Now let's say I call it a day and I want to go home and still continue working from my laptop at home. After I arrive home, I decide to start up my Lync client and resume my discussion with my colleague who is in the data center. So here I've moved outside of the branch and outside of corporate. And as you can see from home, the signaling still goes through my SBA because I'm pooled at the SBA, and then reaches out to my colleague, while audio and video happens peer-to-peer still. So now that we've seen all the scenarios when the WAN is available, let's see what happens when the WAN is down and when the SBA is down. In the scenario where the WAN is down and I'm calling a colleague of mine who's in the same branch as I, the SBA will deal with signaling between us, and audio can still flow between us. As you can see here, WAN is down, audio can still flow. And if I want to call a colleague at corporate headquarters, then the SBA leverages a PSM connection, and the call goes through, but only with audio, of course, only using audio, because the WAN connection is required for any video connections. Since the WAN is down, I can't have any video calls with my party at the data center, even though he may be able to call other parties or other colleagues of his at corporate headquarters using video. In the scenario where I'm roaming and I'm calling that colleague who is at corporate headquarters, then the backup pool is used, because the primary pool registrar in the SBA is out of reach when the WAN is down. In this scenario, the call still makes its way through, and I'm able to leverage the complete list of Lync's functionality, because again, I'm using the backup pool even though I'm SBA homed. So you can see here, the WAN is down, but I use my backup pool for signaling, and I have full functionality. In this scenario, the call still makes its way through, and everything works perfectly. But again, you're adding load to the data center pool, and that's not what you want to do. So you got to work on getting that WAN back up. Finally, if I'm back at my branch and the SBA is down, but the WAN PSTN connections are up, let's assume that, I'm still able to register with the backup pool registrar in the data center. And again, the complete list of Lync functionality is available to me. But this is still not an ideal situation to be in for a long time, because your signaling traffic is going through the data center rather than being offloaded to the SBAs. And that's the primary reason you've invested in SBAs in the first place, to offload the data center and have some logic at the branch. So we're, just like you had to work on bringing back that WAN, in this scenario, try and bring back that SBA. As you may recall, one of the features of version 2 of the SBA specification was that it enables routing through 3G and 4G connections. Let's see how this happens. Here you have a sunny day scenario again, where everything is up and running. Now let's assume the WAN connection goes down. Using the 4G, 3G routing capabilities of the SBA, the signaling only of the link calls can now happen through the 3G, 4G connections, as shown here, while the audio for the call can go through the PSTN connection, as shown here. It is important to note that in this case, we are not transversing the audio connection through the 3G, 4G calls, but you can do that in extreme situations, as we might discuss later. Now that you've seen how SBAs can help employees increase productivity and enable business continuity during failures, let's see how SBAs become qualified so that you can make sure that you're buying an SBA of the right caliber for your Lync deployments. Partners need to go through a rigid qualification process for their SBAs. And it's not just for SBAs. We have a similar qualification process for gateways, SIP trunks, PBXs, and many other infrastructure components. Here you see it's composed of mainly 4 steps. Partners firstly sign up to the program. AudioCodes have already signed up. They join the Microsoft Connect. They join the Microsoft Partner Network, and they sign the necessary agreements. Then they download the Lync interoperability tool, which Alan mentioned initially. This is a tool that partners can download and helps them automate their validation of their device and firmware with Lync 2010. So the tool acts as if it's Lync 2010, sends appropriate messages, gets responses, and sees if the if the device meets the specification. Now, there are still some manual steps that partners need to execute. It's not fully automated, but we're working on improving that in the tool. After partners are done with their validation of a particular firmware, for example, and note that every particular firmware update needs to undergo qualification if it's to be supported by Microsoft. Of course, partners can make their own support statements for versions that are not included in our list. After that happens, partners go through formal testing through a third-party provider, such as TechVision or Wipro. And when they're qualified, they are added to our list of qualified partners, and basically the website here, technet.microsoft.com/UCOIP, which is Unified Communications Open Interoperability Program. That website includes all our qualified partners to date, and I recommend you go there if you have questions on which devices are supported. Here's a quick snapshot of that website. It shows the multiple tabs of the different kinds of devices, infrastructure devices that we qualify. Like I said, gateways in the direct SIP area tab, and IPPBXs, SBCs, and load balancers. We also have the SBA tab. And here I show the AudioCodes list of qualified devices. Now, the firmware version here is very important, because if AudioCodes issues a new version update, let's say 1.1.8.22, that version has a minor tweak or minor bug fix. It has not been tested by Microsoft because there may be repercussions on a particular bug fix, so it's not qualified in terms of Microsoft, but AudioCodes can support that and address your concerns. So this and we work with AudioCodes and other partners to increase or continually update this website with more and more firmware updates as they become available. There are many other SBA qualified partners, and actually, as of 7/16, we had these 5 partners, AudioCodes being one of them, and every one of these partners has multiple devices and multiple firmwares that they support. So if you're asking yourself which SBA provider should I choose, my answer is if you're deploying Lync, first take a look at the Lync UC OIP page on TechNet, which I pointed you to, and choose any one of the SBA providers that are listed there as qualified for Lync, and make sure you pick one that meets your branch size, as we discussed earlier with the different firmware versions and the SBA specifications. And click on the appropriate device that you have interest in, and move into its specifications and read more about it, and contact the partner. As I wrap up here, I have 3 calls to action for you guys. Make sure you always work with a qualified SBA for your Lync deployments so that you can get support from Microsoft and the partner, in this case AudioCodes. If it's not listed on our website, go directly to AudioCodes. And if you're working with another SBA provider other than AudioCodes, and they're not on the qualification program, introduce them to the qualification program so that you have the Microsoft backing, because otherwise you're on your own with that SBA partner. And finally, if you have any questions, reach out to this email address, and let us know if you have any concerns or comments or feedback. Here are some additional resources that I highly recommend. Voice Resiliency Deep Dive and more about SBAs. And here's a link about deploying the Survivable branch appliance or server. So it goes into depth on both. And like I mentioned initially, there are a bunch of case studies. Here's a link. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And thank you, Alan, for this opportunity. And the floor is always back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Tarek, and I appreciate you providing the content. It's a lot of hard work clearly involved in preparing those slides, so we really do appreciate it. So next we're going to spend a few minutes with Alex Beletsky and hear about some real-world experiences. So Alex, if I guess we're going to do this interview style. And I'll let you drive the slides. So why don't we just start out, Alex, just with a brief introduction to who is Sentri and your role in the company.
Sure. Sentri is a Microsoft Consulting Services partner. We virtually exclusively deploy Microsoft technology across the whole Microsoft stack. We specialize in unified communication collaboration and have done many voice deployments, everything from full PBX replacements with Lync all the way through down to hybrid deployments where we have a mixture of legacy and new software. We have been Partner of the Year for Microsoft for the last 3 years in a row. And continue to lead the advocacy for integrated technology and help customers with actually leverage this technology, increase productivity, etc. So my role within the organization is a technology architect. I help organizations architect the solutions that they're deploying. Because let's keep in mind when we're talking about unified communications and Lync, it's not just about a voice. It's about how it integrates the rest of the infrastructure. And what I'd like to talk about today is some kind of real-world experiences around the different scenarios and decision criteria that you use to deploy these solutions in different types of organizations and scenarios.
Great. So we talked earlier about you brought a couple of customer examples along. So why don't you start out, just give us a little bit of background about the first customer example, and we'll go from there.
Okay, no problem. And I encourage everybody who's listening to use the Q&A section to ask any clarifying questions you'd like, because the devil's in the details when it comes to some of these things. So first customer example is a coexistence example. So other than reading from the slide, I just want to talk to it really. The customer wanted to switch over to Lync, but they made an investment in another PBX only 18 months prior to that. So it was going to be a slower deployment for them. And what they wanted to do was bring up core Lync infrastructure, integrate it into the existing PBX, and we used a gateway, an AudioCodes gateway with session border control functionality to do that. But then their first scenarios were to deploy remote offices where they had either aging infrastructure or no infrastructure because they were acquiring something and moving to the new site. So in those scenarios, we used the AudioCodes Survivable branch appliances for the remote offices to provide servability and integrate them into Lync, which was centrally, which is then interop with Cisco on their end. And this is a slightly older slide, so in about 12 months at this point in time, they'll be converting over Cisco and going completely Lync. So in that scenario, it's a remote office scenario. Most of the remote offices were what we call primary tier 1 offices, which required survivability of voice. So every office in that scenario had an SBA deployed. The other example that I want to talk about, and it's I think more interesting in general, is if somebody wants to deploy Lync overall within the organization and top down, where you have to make every single decision when you're architecting these solutions, you have to go through a lot of use case analysis. So while it's good to say that SBA does this, this, and this, and Survivable branch server or standard server does X, Y, and Z, you really need to break things down into use cases. So in this particular example, the organization had international offices. They had over 40 offices in North America, and they wanted to centralize as much of this infrastructure as possible, right? So it was an interesting project in the sense that we have to really dig deep and define what the use cases and user requirements are. And what we determined after working with a networking team within their organization is that they've already built a lot of redundancy into their network. So, and they invested in MPLS and they invested in a lot of bandwidth. So when it came down to survivability, if we had to use an actual SBA, it would have been a tertiary failure. So the network was already redundant, so the network had to experience a primary failure and a secondary failure, and only then did we fail over to an SBA. So what they decided to do was to identify offices as primary large, primary small, secondary large, secondary small, and then tertiary offices. So for the primary large offices, where you're going to have, in their case, 100 or more people, we decided to deploy a standard Lync server. It's just a virtual appliance the way we did it, and a traditional AudioCodes gateway versus without the SBA capability, because the standard server would handle everything the SBA would do, and the gateway would provide local analog or PRI-based outage in case we had a primary network failure. The reason why we did that is because, A, we wanted to localize some services. So a lot of those larger offices, the people would be having conference calls and things like that between themselves, and we didn't want to bring that traffic all the way through the network. And then in case they did have a hard failure, everything would survive for that particular office. The smaller primary offices, we just deploy a standard SBA. So as Tariq said in his presentation, if you had a network failure, we'd be able to be up and running, and with a 3G, 4G capability that we have in the SBA version 2, you'd still be able to do signaling and IM and things like that through that. So that was a feature. But interestingly enough, for some of the smaller offices that were distributed that were, let's call it tier 3 offices, the clients themselves decided not to do anything. They said, you know, if we have a network outage in that office, we have bigger problems. Most of our folks have cell phones on them, and they're running a Lync client on their cell phone. So worst case scenario, They log into the Lync client on their cell phone, enable simultaneous ring, so when somebody tries to get them at the office, their cell phone will ring. So cell phones became their backup scenario in those situations. So it's interesting to kind of go through this process for larger deployments and figure out what the use cases are and what's the right technology to deploy. And it doesn't matter, as an example, how much the hardware can support. Like in the example Tariq gave you, SBA can support up to 1,000 users. Well, okay, that's great, but how much does your bandwidth the support for that scenario? So that becomes a bottleneck before we run out of hardware capacity in a lot of cases. So fairly interesting scenarios. We've worked with AudioCodes for quite a while. They are definitely our vendor of choice, and although you can deploy, all of the, Microsoft does a very thorough job of certifying everybody out there. The selection criteria we used when we were selecting these gateways was who has the best support options and the widest skill set across the country. So you have to get a professional services consultant or employee who has previous experience. AudioCodes has just a lot more of that than some of the other vendors. Like Ferrari is an example, pretty good gateway, but there's very few people in the U.S. that know how to deploy or have any experience or expertise. So that's the other criteria that I encourage everybody to look at is what is the support infrastructure that's available in the market for the hardware you choose in that. And Alan, I'm happy to answer any additional questions you have or go into any level of detail.
Good. Good. Well, appreciate that, Alex. First of all, appreciate the kind words. And just a quick thought on your second case study. It's interesting that dovetails nicely into what our previous session was, where we talked about mobility and pushing the using the mobile client on employees' own smart devices that sort of has an impact on their survivability strategy. So interesting there.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, even though we don't recommend to use 4G for survivability, because of where networks are going, we actually have some clients that are using LTE-based 4G as their secondary internet connections. And when they're in good signal strength, and you have to do some testing before you do this, but they can carry 2 or 3 conversations as a backup if the MPLS fails. So we use that for voice as well, although only in specific scenarios where we've tested the heck out of it and the latency is low.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, we're a little long here, so I'm going to move on. I've just got a couple of slides here to talk about the product portfolio from AudioCodes, our SBA portfolio. I see there's a couple of questions here trickled in about sizing. I wanted to point out AudioCodes manufactures 3 different SBA platforms. The Median 800, 1000, and 2000 are available in SBA configurations. The 800 and 1000 are by far the most common. The 800 usually in the small branches, and the 1000 in the mid-sized branches. When you get above the, the Median 2000 and larger branch offices, we typically see situations where they're deploying a full link pool out of those offices, somewhat like Alex showed in his case study. That either with a Median 2000 or 3000 gateway for those larger regional offices. When it comes to the capability, there's a handful of configurations. The Median 800 can either be bought in a single T1 or E1 span, or in a combination of analog ports with up to 12 analog ports. In the Median 800, the Median 1000 is available with 2, 4, and multiples of 4, all the way up to 24 analog ports, or up to 4 T1s or E1s. And of course, this fits nicely with that survivability strategy. A couple notes too. The Median 800 also, one of the unique things it does is it provides 12 ports of power Ethernet LAN switch ports, which are really nice for the very small offices where you've only got a handful of PCs or phones, and provide the connectivity and power Ethernet for the phones at those remote sites. So real good selection here. They're really basically custom designed for this kind of application, and certainly available through our traditional distribution. Just a quick note to the handful of partners that are listening, and just want to remind you folks that as being a member or part of our partner program, whether you're at the elite, certified, or registered level, that you, as part of your membership, have access to our not-for-resale or lab discount program with varying levels of discount. And strongly would encourage you to use that program if you've not yet used an SBA or is just starting to dabble with it. It's a really good next step in your education process for branch offices. So it makes a lot of sense to test this stuff on the bench or in the lab before you go whole hog.
All right, well, that was really good.
Yes, it was very, very helpful, especially those businesses that, again, are scattered all over the globe. Hopefully now we have some vision as to what all is involved in providing survivability.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what's coming up in session 7?
So session 7, we're going to start to talk about call recording and compliance. You know, there's a number of businesses that by government regulation have to record and archive the conversations with their customers or their contacts. So have a little in-depth discussion of how that process happens and talk about the architectures and some software that AudioCodes provides to do that.
Great, a very important topic. You should definitely check it out.